All right, welcome. I'm Jessica. I'm one of the School and Teacher Programs Coordinators at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. Welcome to our first educator workshop of the school year. I'm joined today by our guest speaker, Jenny Gillett, performing artist and puppeteer at the Natural History Museum and La Brea Tar Pits, and off-screen by Rachel Fiddler, our manager of school and teacher programs at the Natural History Museum and the La Brea Tar Pits. We'd love to know who's joining us today. Please let us know in the chat. We'd love to know your name, where you're joining us from, and what grade level and subjects you teach. Or maybe you're a parent and you're supporting your child at home. Let us know. We've got some teachers in LAUSD, kindergarten, some folks in Laverne. All right, thanks for sharing. We're going to cover a couple of quick things before we dive into the good stuff. This webinar is going to be about an hour long. It is being recorded right now, and it will be posted to the Natural History Museum's YouTube page once it's finished. You'll also receive it in a follow-up email that will include sample activities, how-tos, and links to all the resources mentioned during the presentation, as well as a certificate of participation. On today's agenda, we've got a brief introduction to the online Rise Up L.A. exhibit. There is also an in-person exhibit, but today we'll be focusing on the online exhibit. Then our guest speaker, Jenny Gillett, will talk a little about her background and career path to the museum. She'll give an overview of the Performing Arts Department at the Natural History Museum, and she'll talk about the Oral Stories project that she launched with Rise Up L.A. We'll then talk a little about how you can use primary sources like oral stories in your classroom and give you some tips on how you and your students can access the museum's digitized collections from home. And lastly, we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A with Jenny. Please feel free to utilize the question feature on Zoom as we go, and we'll get to as many of your questions as possible during the Q&A. But first, we've got a quick poll just to get everyone warmed up. The first question is, what is your level of comfort using digitized collections? And our second question is, why did you decide to join today's virtual educator workshop? We'll share the results in just a bit. Give you a couple more minutes to respond. All right. So it looks like 83% have some basic knowledge using digitized collections, and 50-50 on why you decided to join today's webinar, to learn more about education at the museum and to learn more about the Rise Up LA exhibit. And then we've got 17% are here to learn more about oral stories. All right, let's jump right in. So Rise Up LA, A Century of Votes for Women is our newest exhibit. It launched virtually on August 18th to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment that officially granted women the right to vote. Rise Up LA highlights women across Los Angeles who advocate for equality on the front lines, as well as through everyday acts of bravery and courage, and features unique stories, activities, and links to related events. The in-person exhibit at the museum will feature more than 100 objects, including political buttons, protest posters, flyers, and ephemera, and stories about choices women faced in a century of struggle. And we'll drop a link to the online exhibit in the chat. Right now, you can explore some of these things through the virtual exhibit. For example, this collection of political buttons in the online exhibit highlights the different causes and candidates that women would have supported over the years. You can scroll through the pins and you'll see a description like the one highlighted to learn that this "Vote No for My Sake" political button that used an image of a child was part of a successful campaign in 1920 to ban the sale of alcohol in the hope that it would stop men from drinking their paychecks away and neglecting or abusing their wives and children. You can also check out what was on the fall ballot in 1920 through this interactive. You can cast your vote and see what the results were. There's a call to action with a link to register to vote, and an activities page, a few of which are the Posters of Positivity activity, which is created by Artworks L.A., a local nonprofit that works to combat the high school dropout crisis by creatively engaging alternative education high school students. You have the DIY oral story interview, which will be included in our resources packet and which Jenny will touch on later, and an interactive timeline that dates from 1785 to the present and highlights 100 women who have made a difference in LA. And lastly, you have a link to the Rise Up L.A. Voices from the Women's Movement page. This is the oral stories project that Jenny will be talking about in a little bit. You can find a link to the 3-part When Women Vote discussion series, which is an NHM partnership with Zocalo Public Square, a local nonprofit ideas exchange that partners with organizations like NHM to present free public events. And you can also find story highlights from the Angelinos Building Community Series. So that's a quick overview of what you can find in the online exhibit. In addition to this, we'll also be sharing some resources for you and your students to access our online collections. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to our guest speaker, Jenny Gillett. Jenny, thank you for joining us today. Please take it away.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jenny Gillett. Happy to be here with you today. I am a member of the performing arts team here at the Natural History Museum. And we can move on to the next slide. I'll let you know a little more about our program. So normally, if we were not in the middle of a pandemic, you would see me puppeteering this juvenile triceratops at the Natural History Museum. Or if you were to come to the La Brea Tar Pits, you could see me puppeteering a life-size saber-toothed cat. So normally I am a part of this performing arts team. We run the Encounters program. But now that we are facing this virtual world and COVID-19, we are trying to shift to more digital programming. So that was sort of part of the impetus for creating this oral stories project in conjunction with Rise Up L.A. So I'll talk about that a little bit more later. That in addition to the Encounters program, our team also does special events programming. Some of us are teaching artists, some of us are stunt performers, aerialists, all kinds of creative educators. So a little bit more about my background so you can get to know how I got here. Initially I was an actor. I also had a physical theater and yoga and performance background. I knew some people from the museum because my theater company had performed a site-specific piece there. And they were building this saber-toothed cat puppet that you see pictured here. And I happened to be the right height and shoe size to fit in this puppet, which, as you can see, is fairly specific since we actually do get inside to operate it. And I was called in for an audition, potentially the most specific audition of my career. It just happened to work out, and now I am a puppeteer and teaching artist at the museum. As you can also see the picture on the right, I am portraying Mary Anning, who is a real historical figure. So that's a little bit about my background specifically at the museum. I came to oral stories sort of because of my background as a teaching artist as well. So another thing that I do, I work at the museum. Sorry, my baby is here and he's being noisy. I work at the museum. I also work as a teaching artist in LAUSD schools right now through a program called the Unusual Suspects, which some of you may know. I'm currently doing a residency at Joyner Elementary in South LA. And I guess I'm interested, as many of you may be, in the methods that you've been using to adapt creatively to these digital times in your classroom. I know that in my classes, I have been trying to maintain some movement and some physical performances, or just time that kids can get up and move around. I feel like I myself, in the time of the pandemic, have been doing a lot of sitting. So I think it's important to remember to incorporate that into my classes, even though we are in this digital world. So I'd love to hear from you in the chat. If any of you have any ideas you'd like to share, things that you've been doing to adapt creatively in these virtual times, please do type them in and share them. And while you're thinking of doing that, I'll continue talking about my personal background. So worked at the museum back until 2013, and then I went over to the Skirball Cultural Center, worked in their school programs as well. And then I moved to New York, and when I was in New York, I did a couple of things. First, I pursued a master's degree at New York University in educational theater, and I became a doula, or a birth coach. So two sort of fairly different things, but they kind of came together because when I was at NYU, I happened to take a class in ethnodrama, or interview-based theater. And when I was working as a doula, I had a lot of women and birth partners tell me stories about their birth. And it got me thinking, gee, we really don't have a lot of space in our culture for birth stories. We don't really talk about birth that much. So I decided to start conducting formal interviews. I interviewed dozens of birth partners, recent mothers, also other birth workers and some medical professionals over the course of a year. And then I put some of those verbatim interviews together and created this piece that I called Tokophobia. So it was an interview-based theater piece, words taken verbatim from these interviews. And this is a photo of a workshop production in New York a couple of years ago. So, as I said, when we sort of entered into this period of COVID-19, we were trying to think of things that we could do virtually and digitally at the museum. And Rise Up L.A., our exhibit that is now being showcased virtually, kind of seemed like a perfect opportunity to do interviews and an interview-based theater project. So, I see we have something coming into the chat. Lori Beth says she creates dance videos for her students. They practice them on their own and then practice them in class together. I love that. I think that, yes, moving has been really refreshing for me too, as a teacher, and hopefully for my students. So I think that's wonderful that you are dancing together through Zoom. But we can move on to the next slide. We'll talk a little more about Rise Up. So Rise Up LA oral stories. So the demographic that we chose to pursue for this project was women in Southern California over the age of 65. And I got to speak to 31 women. We only have 30 interviews officially because one woman opted to sort of remove her interview because of the personal content. But 31 women interviewed about their experiences with the women's movement, about gender equality, and how they've seen those things grow and change over the years and over their lifetimes. And it was fascinating to hear all of these women's stories, all of their views. And I really think it was a part of the exhibit that was important. Hearing these anecdotes and hearing these opinions from people, especially people here locally in Los Angeles and Southern California, was a really important piece, because I think there's a level of engagement and a level of personal connection that can be created through oral stories that really resonated with me as an interviewer, but hopefully with the people viewing and listening as well. So we had a couple of iterations of this project. First off, you can hear all of the interviews on SoundCloud, which is really wonderful and kind of unique, because that's not something that always happens in interview-based theater. Usually you hear curated pieces, but you don't really get to hear the whole interviews. So that's pretty special. We also had we have clips that are in the online exhibition itself. And we had a video that's on NHM's YouTube. There's a few parts to this video. And the first part, you can hear clips from 10 of the interviews. And there's also some archival images that go with those clips. So I will let that speak for itself. It's only about 4 or 5 minutes long. And I feel like it gives a really good overview of this project as a whole. So here we go.
Yeah, I think I've been a feminist since I'm about 12, 13, yeah.
Anything that kicked that off for you at 12 or 13?
Not being able to have a bat mitzvah.
Oh,
It was it was all about not being able to. I was the best Hebrew school student they had, and yet because of the time there was no bat mitzvah at the time. So that's what kicked it off. I would have intense arguments with the rabbi about this, and he would never budge, never. I was never allowed to go up on the bima. I was never allowed to be in the central synagogue. I always had to be up in the balconies. That was a rough path. I think my experience with Judaism turned me into a feminist.
When I was 59, my mother had passed away, and I wanted a Harley. Ride a Harley motorcycle. So I actually went and took classes. I bought a big Harley. I learned to ride it, and it was such a fulfilling thing, because people acknowledged you. You know, as a woman on a bike like that, people would come up to you and put their thumbs up, and and women would be like, "How did you do that?" I said, "Actually, it was easier than I thought." So things like that are empowering. The stuff that I did that I initially was afraid to do and did it anyway is what empowers you. And it gives you the encouragement to move on to the next thing.
I went over to the branch manager's desk and I said, "Excuse me, I'm getting paid less than these young men and I'm training them." He said, "Well, yes, they're in the management trainee program and you're a bank teller." I said, "Oh, I didn't know there was a management trainee program. How would I get into the management trainee program?" "Oh, it's not open to women." And I got kind of feisty and I said, "Then maybe you better find somebody with exterior plumbing to train them, because I'm obviously not competent enough to train somebody who's eligible for that kind of position." And he said, "Young lady, that will get you right out the front door of this bank." And I said, "Funny, that's where I came in."
Well, I think because I grew up under segregation and just being a Black girl, sometimes it's hard to tease out what's gender inequality, what's racial inequality. I will say that I grew up at a time that people had very fixed ideas about what girls should do and what boys should do, and including, telling girls like myself that they should kind of conceal their smartness from boys.
We're open. We listen. We learn to take care of each other. And we rely on our sisterhood to take care of us, because there's something uniquely binding as women, that we will always be able to take care of each other and rely on each other no matter what. I think that is something I'm very, very proud of.
I am a retired educator, and I do believe very, very strongly that girls from a very young age should be given the tools that are required to develop the resilience and the brilliance that we know women can achieve.
It was never a doubt in my mind that I could be anything I wanted to be. My parents gave me that, and I really do appreciate that they did that for me.
When I was a teenager, I was poking around in our garage and I found a stack of books that my father intended to give away, and one of them was Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. And I brought that inside and I was reading it and I thought, yeah, women shouldn't all have to be housewives, you know? We're individuals. Why can't we do different things with our lives too?
I found women that I worked with who really were bosses. And a couple of them really told me what I needed to do in order to be really focused and to learn everything I could. If you're on a job, learn everybody else's job, because you never know when you may have to fill in, or if you want to grow and learn and do things. That's what you have to do, and you have to be better than everybody else. That much I did learn at home.
Well, how are we going to rule the world if we don't, in the beginning at least, get the vote?
All right. So that is just one part of this YouTube share out that we did back in August. The online Rise Up LA exhibition opened August 18th, which is also the day of the 100-year anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. So to complement all of that, we presented this YouTube video. There's a few parts to it. There's a brief introduction from my manager. There is also this clip that you just saw. And then there's about a 25-minute conversation between myself and 3 of our interviewees. And that is sort of the first step in building this interview-based theater piece. It's a little more informal than reading a script from these interviews. It was more, I chose 3 questions and we kind of revisited them and elaborated on those stories. And then there's a 4th portion where I speak with Sarah Crawford, who was the exhibition designer for Rise Up L.A. So you can learn a little bit more about the exhibit itself and the concepts that went into building it. So if you have time, I do hope you'll be able to watch the whole video, and I'm sure Jessica will share that in the resource packet as well. But for now, a little bit more about the process that goes into creating an oral history or an interview-based theater piece. And I will say there are many, many ways to go about creating interview-based theater. This is just one of them. And I think I was trained in a fairly traditional method. My teacher at NYU, his name was Joe Salvatore, and he was trained by Anna DeVere Smith, who is sort of a well-known and wonderful ethnodramatist. And the way that I was taught is that you pick a set list of questions and ask that same list of questions to all interviewees. So I will say, if you listen to the SoundCloud interviews, the full interviews, you will hear that I occasionally do deviate from that list just a bit. Sometimes we'll go off on a tangent, or somebody will talk about something particular that seems interesting, and so we might elaborate on that a bit. But generally, I stick to this set list of 10 or 12 questions. And here's some samples from that list here. And as I'm discussing this, I'd love to hear what kind of questions or themes might be relevant or interesting in your schools or communities, because we have this sort of fairly specific project material here, speaking to women over 65 about their experiences with the gender equality movement. But within your own schools or your own neighborhoods, there might be themes or questions that could be particularly interesting for you and your students as well. So if you think of anything, please do share those things in the chat, because I personally would love to know. So the question that I started off with is also sort of a traditional ethnodrama question, and that is, what is the story of your birth? And I guess I have a personal interest in that as a birth worker, but I also just think it's interesting. As I said earlier, first of all, we don't really talk about birth that much in our culture. So it's interesting to hear what people know about their birth and the experiences surrounding that. But I also feel like that's just sort of a good icebreaker question. People talk about their birth, but then we also sort of will go into discussing where they're from and early childhood and things like that. And that kind of breaks the ice and just gets us talking. So for this particular project, I did try to find a mix of questions that kind of talk about overarching themes or theory about the women's movement and gender equality, and then some questions that we're trying to get more to anecdotal stories and things like that. So, for example, one of the questions, some of the things are, how have women's rights evolved in your lifetime? Most important victory for women in your lifetime? Things like that sort of got us thinking about big ideas. But then, for example, question number 3, when, if ever, did you first experience gender inequality, got us into some really interesting personal stories. And actually, that was one of the questions that I believe we revisit in our YouTube presentation. So if you watch that, you'll get to hear some of these stories and experiences from our interviewees. So let me see. I see some things in the chat. In terms of questions or themes that might be relevant in your schools, Lord Beth says, when I taught 6th grade last year, we really focused on positive Latino role models since I worked in East LA, which is great. I think too, something that I didn't say is that I feel like all age groups can do some form of interview-based theater, and it is really interesting to work intergenerationally. So I feel this was an intergenerational experience for me. I guess I'm an elder millennial interviewing boomers and older sometimes, and I feel like I learned so much in these interviews, and I gained so much wisdom. So, so if you have high school students or even elementary school students, there can be really interesting ways for them to create conversations. Something else coming to the chat. We have, oops, sorry, something weird happened to my chat. Okay. Alejandra says, I've had my 2nd and 3rd graders interview their elders. That's awesome. I feel like I actually remember maybe my first experience with interview-based theater or with an interview project was when I was extremely young. I was definitely in elementary school. And oh, Laura Beth says, Latinx role models. Thank you. I remember interviewing my great aunt and drawing a picture of her, but then also presenting like a brief interview. And that was, you know, many years ago, but I still remember that. So I do think interviewing, and especially intergenerational interviews, can carry a lot of weight, and even very young students can learn a lot from that. So I guess we can move on to the next slide. So this is a still from our YouTube presentation. So there's myself. To my right is Barbara Sanchez. Above her is Dorsey Dujon. And then to Dorsey's left is Janice Lepelles. So these are 3 of our interviewees, and they all had really interesting stories and wisdom to share. So As I said, this was a little bit more of an informal share out. We revisited 3 questions from the interviews, and eventually we were hoping someday we could do this in person, but it's looking like it's probably going to be another online share out. But the good news is you can all easily attend if you would like to do so. But Rise Up LA is closing online and potentially in person in April. And so by that point, we're hoping to have a full script taken verbatim from all of these interviews. And from these 30 interviews that we have available to us, I've been slowly transcribing pieces from each interview. And the hope is that I'll take, I think, 6 to 8 participants and have them share their words and stories. And I think given a longer process, you can get very, like I said, you can kind of do this any way you would like, but the way that I have done it in the past is to really conduct it like a qualitative research project. So I would take maybe 2 to 4 5 minutes or less snippets from each interview, transcribe them, and then once I have all of those snippets, I would kind of lay them out and look for overlapping themes in all of these interviews. And then from that, maybe some sort of story arc will emerge, and that's how we can begin to create a script. But the process that you'll see here in this YouTube clip is definitely helping to begin shaping some of these themes as well. So we can go to the next slide. Yes. So I really hope that this is useful and of interest to you and to your students. One way that you can start off brainstorming with them, if you'd like to do one of these projects in your classes, is to visit our DIY oral story interview project. That's myself and one of our interviewees, Dorsey Dujon, pictured there. You can find the DIY oral story interview project on our project page. The website's listed below. And also on our project page, you can find a link to the YouTube presentation. You can also find a link to SoundCloud, which is all of the interviews in full. And as I said, I think that's maybe the most special component of this whole project, because usually when one conducts, when one is creating an ethnodrama or interview-based theater piece, you sort of choose curated parts, but you don't get to hear the full interviews and the full stories. So the fact that our interviewees were, authorized us to share the full interviews is really wonderful and really insightful. So I definitely would encourage you to visit that as well if you have time to check out some of the full interviews. So I think pretty soon we're going to move into a Q&A portion. But for now, I'm going to pass it back to Jessica, who's going to share some more information and resources.
Thank you, Jenny. If you've got any questions for Jenny, please drop them in the Q&A and we'll get to your questions shortly. But first, I just want to go over some classroom resources we've gathered for you and your students. I've listed here a few resources for accessing primary sources, which can include artifacts, diaries, manuscripts, recordings, or any other source of information that was created at the time under study. So first, we've got the Seaver Center for Western History Research, which is physically located inside the Natural History Museum and currently has about 34,000 records online. You can access the records directly from the NHM page. We'll drop the link in the chat so you can check that out. Accessing the digital collections can be a little bit clunky, so we'll be sending a how-to. In addition to the how-to, our collections manager, Betty Uyeda, recommends using finding aids, which are lists of what is available in individual collections. Links for the Seaver Center's finding aids will be included in the resource packet. And in addition to the Seaver Center, there is calisphere.org. This is a great resource. You can find over 1 million digitized items from libraries, archives, museums throughout the state, and the 10 UC campuses. It really is a great place to start and has a pretty accessible interface. I have this image here that I happened upon when looking through the NHM collections there. This is from 1937. It's what was the bone room in the basement of the Natural History Museum. From the look of the windows, I believe this basement is now home to our Marine Biodiversity Center. And we'll drop the link for that as well. And just quickly, we do want to mention that the resource packet will also include a list of Common Core and California History Social Science standards that are relevant to this exhibit. Oral stories projects are great for hitting Common Core standards, and primary sources in the exhibit support California History Social Science standards. So with that, we'll head into our Q&A session. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the questions function on Zoom.
And I guess I will ask too, because, we do have one question. How long should an interview be? So I feel like I usually targeted or blocked out for myself somewhere between 45 minutes to an hour and 15 minutes. I think my shortest interview was like 35 minutes and my longest was like 2 hours. And I actually had to excuse myself because it was so long and it was wonderful and we could have kept talking forever, but I think I actually had to go do something else. But I would say leaving about an hour is good, unless maybe if your students are younger, then maybe targeting a little bit of a shorter period of time. But I actually think for young people, it is sort of a good model or a good idea to have a set list of questions to begin, because then you can kind of prepare for the interview process by creating questions together, maybe even doing practice interviews in class. And then, you can let students know that if they get on an interesting tangent, they can, of course, deviate from that question list. But having a set list of questions is kind of a good way to prepare and discuss ahead of time and to give them some confidence. Any other questions, Jessica?
Thanks, Jenny. We do have a question. Does NHM have a virtual tour?
You can take that one. I don't know.
We can go ahead and share the YouTube page. We do have tours that have themes throughout the museum. So there's a dino tour that you can check out. We've got virtual field trips as well, if you want to check those out. So we'll drop a link to the YouTube page.
Cool. I see a question, and I guess I was also going to ask a moment ago, does anyone else have memories of doing interviews when they were in school? Because I loved when somebody brought up that they had done interviews with their very young students. It brought up a memory for me that may inspire me in future work. So if anybody also has memories of doing interviews themselves in their youth, I'd love to hear that in the chat. And Rachel asked, how do you suggest guiding students in writing their own interview questions? I think it's so specific to what kind of stories you are pursuing. So I think before you start writing questions, it's maybe good to target some themes within your school or community. So because our theme that we were pursuing was the women's movement or the gender equality movement, that really helped to guide my question creation process. And like I said, I knew that I wanted to have some questions that focused on sort of big ideas that had to do with the movement, and then some that had to do with anecdotes and stories. So that helped to guide my process. So I think choose a theme first, or choose some sort of larger goal. Although having too specific of a goal, I think is not necessarily good, because it can be limiting. But once you choose an overarching goal or theme, that can help direct your question process.
Thank you, Jenny. We do have another question from Lori Beth. Lori Beth asks, what do you use to splice the videos together if we wanted to do a similar montage to share? Jenny, can you speak on that?
Wow. Okay. So I will confess that I am not the tech person behind the video, but I did edit the audio together. And I think I just used GarageBand, but I feel like that doesn't have a great interface. Something that I've used in the past with students when I worked at the Skirball was a program called Hindenburg. And Hindenburg was an audio editing program that I thought was a pretty easy to use interface. So for editing together audio, I'd recommend checking that out. There's also Audacity is free, but the interface, it looks like it's from like 1992. So just a disclaimer there, but it's also free. So that's good. And I think our creative team created the actual video. So I don't know, Jessica, if you know anything about that process.
No, I wouldn't be able to comment on that. We do have another question, Jenny.
Yeah.
So we have Saida. Saida is asking, I'm working on a unit on developing character. Our essential question is, why do we value qualities in other people? How can I go about developing an interview as a culminating project for this unit? Can this be done in Google Slides?
A unit on developing character. First of all, that's really cool that you're doing a unit about developing character, because that's kind of a wonderful thing just to be discussing. I wonder, gosh, so I will say that we as a department are trying to think about how interviews can kind of complement all different kinds of exhibits and projects. I feel like in this case, maybe it would be interesting for the interviewer to think of certain qualities that they value, and then to go and seek out people that they think possess those qualities and discuss why they find them to be important or why that's resonant with them. But it seems like there's so many wonderful things that you could do with that. Or maybe to interview, I don't know, I feel like that could be a really cool opportunity for an intergenerational project as well, to explore what qualities are interesting to each generation and how and if that has changed. I feel like, I don't know, I now I'm starting to see younger people and younger generations and feel like we share very different qualities. So that might be an interesting thing to explore in terms of an intergenerational piece, to have students interview older people and or younger people, depending on how old the students are as well. But what a cool thing. I don't know that much about Google Slides, though. I don't know, Jessica, if you know that program.
Yeah, I don't see why you wouldn't be able to use Google Slides for this. Let's see. It seems like you can make a pretty good presentation or like a packet for your students, have different pages for them. So yeah, it should be totally doable. This is also a really interesting project to see if there's any overlap from maybe the older generation remembering, oh, I also felt like that at your age, and seeing how things have changed.
Oh.
Thanks, Jenny. We do have another question.
Mhm.
Alejandra asks, did you have anyone with special ed background within the project?
Yeah, so not in this particular project, but another program that our performing arts department does. Well, when we were gathering in person, we did present an encounters performance for neurodiverse families or neurodiverse audiences, rather. So that is something that hopefully, once we are able to gather together again, we can revisit. And we may even, we've been presenting puppet shows through Zoom. And so we actually have been talking about adapting some of that for neurodiverse audiences as well. So I hope that answers that question.
Thanks, Jenny.
I will say too, I've been reading in the chat, I love hearing the interviews that you all remember. And I see a couple people remember interviewing grandparents. And that's, I actually, so for my first interview project, I did that as well. I interviewed my grandmother about her birth experiences. And she has since passed away. And the past couple years, on the anniversary of her passing, we've listened to those audio interviews. And it's such a special thing to have. So that's awesome that a couple of you remember interviews with grandparents as well.
Yeah, it's really sweet. Jenny, would you like to mention Your Story Matters?
Yeah, so I will say this is an initiative at the museum. I'm not directly involved in this, but I know a little bit about it. I think that it is sort of a little bit of a less formal process in terms of recording stories, but the Your Story Matters initiative, I believe, is documenting stories of people's experiences during the pandemic, during this period of COVID-19. So that's something that is available to all if people want to record their stories. And I believe, Jessica, if I'm right, that it's housed then in the Seaver Center?
I believe so. I believe Betty's working on that. And Rachel just dropped the link in the chat for that as well, if you'd like to learn more. If there aren't any more questions, I think we can wrap up. Jenny, do you have anything else you'd like to share?
No, I really appreciated hearing from all of you and hearing about initiatives that you're pursuing in your schools and also just about your experiences with interviewing. And I do hope that, especially in this virtual time when it is sort of more difficult to create connections with people, I hope that you can find a way to utilize programming like this so that your students can maybe create some new digital connections, but really they run so deep for me. I did sort of doubt the Zoom platform at first because I'm used to interviewing in person, but it was so significant and it was so wonderful. And it was also, I think, particularly important to me in this period of isolation to be able to connect with new people in such a deep way. And I see somebody's asking, how can we watch the recording? I think they are sending an info packet, but Jessica, do you have the link to our webpage that you could drop one more time?
Yeah, definitely. If you go to our YouTube page, the recording will automatically be saved there.
Awesome. I also have the full Oral Stories Project page that I can drop, and that has just about everything that we've mentioned: the SoundCloud, the YouTube, and lots of other little quotes and interesting information as well.
Thank you, Jenny, for sharing your time and expertise with us today. And thank you to our audience for joining us today. So there will be a follow-up email for those who registered with a recording of the webinar. It's also on YouTube. The packet will include links, the lesson plans, activities, how-tos, and a certificate of completion for participating in today's webinar. Our next event will be in a couple of weeks, so please be sure to sign up for our teacher email list to be the first to know about our new resources and upcoming events. For more information on all of our online distance learning resources, check out our website, nhm.org, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.